Good afternoon to all. Willkommen, bienvenue, and welcome. For those that missed the first part of the presentations this morning, my name is Trevor Miller. I am a solutions architect for Perficient. I work in the same team as what Mark does, but I focus really heavily on the real-time media aspects of Teams. So to Joel's questions earlier around some of the calling features and some of the dialect conferencing functionality, that's the kind of technology that I will assist customers with, and especially for customers that are still utilizing Skype for Business Server or maybe still using Skype for Business Online today. And that does even include some of the third-party technologies like you would see with Cisco or Citrix or VMware, ShoreTel, Nortel, Avaya, etc. So the presentation that I'm going to focus on today is a bit more technology infrastructure heavy, really looking at some of the concepts that have been discussed throughout the course of the day, including some things that Mark just covered and also some pieces that Ron and Joel covered in the morning, but tilting them a bit to cover the elephant in the room, which is COVID-19, and really how that has changed the scenario around remote working, for better and for worse. You get two sides of the same coin. So I'm going to try and cover both of those. I'll show you a couple pieces, demos of some things that some of the IT sysadmins may be appreciative of. So try and get some demos in there for you as well, as opposed to just the talking head. So to give you a quick rundown of what I'd like to cover, first and foremost, I'd like to cover, just recap what is Teams, at least from the chair that I sit in, and some of the pieces and parts that Teams exists of, because Teams itself is really a umbrella platform that sits on top many of the different services within Office 365. And then from there go into a mnemonic that I created on my own. It's not trademarked, feel free to grab it, but the what I call the ICANN elements for Teams, which stand for infrastructure, coexistence, adoption, and navigation, and really cover those four pieces and just give you some feedback and some general guidance on things that we see in the field when it comes to assisting customers with various deployments from other technologies such as Skype or Cisco or WebEx or whatever the case may be into Teams. And then open the floor up for questions at the end, and I'll sprinkle in the demos in there in the midst of it all. So with that said, onward and upward. So first and foremost, there is this beast that is Microsoft Teams, and as I alluded to, it really is three primary slices of technologies that comprise the features and functionalities of the software that is Microsoft Teams. First and foremost, there is the collaboration aspect of Teams, and that's what a lot of maybe the SharePoint admins and some of the Skype for Business folks in the rooms would be used to, Yammer as well. And it really is the synchronous and in some cases asynchronous features within Teams that form the core of the functionality. So that's your teams, that's your channels. In some cases, that includes things like peer-to-peer chats. It may include channel chats as well. It includes the files functionality. So keeping your files in, say, SharePoint or maybe Google Drive or Box. And the collaborative aspects of that with things like co-editing documents, sharing documents, sending a document link to someone who may be in your organization or perhaps outside of your organization. And then on top of that, you get into some of the automation functionalities. So things like the Power Platform or integrating tabs in a team or a channel that may connect you to, say, a on-premises or SaaS-hosted line of business application, or something as simple as OneNote or a whiteboard, or you can go on and on and on and on. But that's really the core in which Teams is built upon. Once you start with that and you begin to progress on the maturity scale, then you move up to really what we're doing today, and that is the meetings aspect of it, where you get a group of people together and you can do things like audio and video and screen sharing, or maybe sharing a whiteboard. In the realm of Teams, there actually are 4 different types of meetings. So first and foremost, what we are on now is actually what is technically considered a private meeting. It's a meeting that was simply scheduled using the plugin within Microsoft Outlook. In addition to that, there are actually 3 other kinds of meetings, and one of them is called Meet Now. The other one is called channel meetings, and both of these are primarily in the Teams client alone, meaning that you really can only schedule them within the Teams client. Meet Now is actually only visible in the calendar interface within Teams, but it's a way to quickly spin up a meeting, and then you can drag people in, say maybe 5 people, 10 people, 50 people, whatever the case may be, and you can quickly collaborate, and then you close the meeting and you move on. Channel meetings are a little bit different in that when you schedule them, instead of them getting deposited onto your Outlook calendar, they go into a team of your choosing in the channel itself, and it's visible there, and it's available for anyone who has access to that team and channel to join the meeting and see the content and see the files, etc. Live events is something that is built on top of the Azure Media Services platform, and this is really meant for your town hall one-to-many kind of scenarios where you have a small subset of presenters that need to present to thousands, maybe up to 10,000 simultaneous users anywhere across the globe. That's what live meetings are. And then on top of that, you have a feature called Cloud Video Interop, and that is really the ability for a customer or an external party that, say, is using like a Cisco video conferencing system, or maybe a Polycom video conferencing system, to actually, quote unquote, dial into the meeting and collaborate just as if they were actually joining from the Teams client. When you get above and beyond just the simple meetings features of using, really just PC to PC functionality, then you get into what Microsoft will call the calling aspects. And it's really embracing a brand new cloud native telephony platform that works not only when you're in the office, but also works extremely well for remote workers and things like the COVID scenarios. And Microsoft really dices it into 2 different pieces. First and foremost is for meetings. I'll start from the bottom up. For meetings themselves, this is a licensable feature. And for people who need to create meetings and send them out to customers or internal parties, whatever the case may be, if you need that old telephone number for your dial-in, meeting dial-in, dial-out it's a license called audio conferencing. And it's very reasonably priced. It's pretty much all you can eat when it comes to the cost of it. Above and beyond that is what Microsoft will call their phone system. And this is really the ability of an end user, such as myself, to actually make phone calls in Teams. So I could call a pizza joint down the street and order pizza. Or maybe call a WebEx 800 number for a customer that may not be using Teams. The calling plans functionality is really, it is the replacement for any customers that may be using Skype for Business Enterprise Voice. The phone system functionality in Teams is really the replacement for that. It's the logical progression of Enterprise Voice from Skype for Business to Teams. And it comes in 2 primary different flavors. The first flavor is what's known as calling plans. And that's really analogous to what you would get with your cell phones, where you get your number from Verizon or AT&T and you just consume minutes that the provider gives you and you pay per month. Direct routing is a little bit more complex. I'll cover this in some future slides here shortly, but it's really meant for the more complex scenarios with customers that are using Skype for Business on-premise to integrate with some existing telephone platforms, or maybe you have a scenario where you've got offices in countries all across the world, and Microsoft can't give you calling plans numbers in those locales. The direct routing plan allows you to drop what's known as a session border controller into those remote countries and get them using Teams while making calls through a phone system circuit that would be in that remote location. And then on top of that, you've got what are called auto attendants and call queues. And really that's some of the advanced routing kind of functionality, the automated routing where you call in and you can, press some keys to search for someone. Or say your service desk needs to have a automated call routing to route calls among 5 people. Call queues, which are in the legacy days called hunt groups, would handle that. So most of my time is really spent on these last 2 columns. And admittedly, those last 2 columns are very important to get right, number one, but are also very sensitive to the network path in which they traverse in order to get from me, the end user, to the Teams services in order to provide good call quality. And for anybody who's used Skype for Business, I'm sure you've all experienced it, the yellow or red bang in the window that says your network is causing poor call quality, please connect to the network or something of that nature. Microsoft has done a lot of work in the Teams realm to really change the way in which the voice and video and audio codecs operate to make it a bit better for customers like myself that simply sit at home as opposed to sitting inside an office. Teams to date is more widely deployed and more available in data centers across Microsoft's cloud solution than Skype for Business Online was before. So a couple things that I'll just point out here is that it is, as has been alluded to, Teams is built on top of Azure and in the Azure Intelligent Edge solutions. So as a result of that, you'll see that many of the data centers that are used by Microsoft for Teams are the same data centers that you will find for Azure data centers. And those data centers are split into 3 regions. These regions become important for customers that may be multinational. If I remember right, I think we had some folks maybe from the Netherlands or somewhere in the EU that were joining. And Microsoft's ability to localize much of the data center infrastructure for these multi-geo tenants is a very big improvement that wasn't necessarily available in Skype for Business Online. So for most customers, most US customers, you'll find your data is either somewhere in the East Coast or the West Coast. For Europe, it's going to be Dublin or Amsterdam. And for Asia Pac, it may be Hong Kong or Singapore. Some of these other locations that you see in here, I've listed them just to give you an idea. If you are a customer that, say, exists solely in Canada, you actually will see your data stored natively in the Canadian tenants as opposed to the American tenants in California and Virginia. And same thing with Europe. So there are data centers being built in United Arab Emirates. We've got locations in Paris and Marseille in France, London and Cardiff, Berlin and Frankfurt, Geneva and Zurich, Johannesburg and Cape Town, Pune, all over the map. So what Microsoft is attempting to do is really truly provide great audio and video over any network that you may come across, and that includes the cellular networks that so many of us rely on today. So moving forward, the calling plans functionality, the red dots on the screen simply show you the countries or locations where you can get a phone number directly from Microsoft. You can get a calling plan license, attach that number to your Teams account, and start making phone calls. You can get phone numbers legitimately in the course of minutes. It's all done through the power of the Teams Admin Center through the Office 365 admin portal. You assign it to the user, and under normal circumstances, within 60 minutes, it's active and away you go. Under the current load, given that so many people are working from home, calling plans, especially for US workers, has been an actual hugely popular scenario for customers that have needed to push people home, but they didn't have a telephony solution available for them. Maybe the company didn't want to or didn't need to pay for cell phone plans for those people. Or in the case of California, if you require an employee to use a cell phone, you have to reimburse them for that cost. In this scenario, you can natively give them a number in Teams and they can make phone calls and act like they were in the office and have no problem. You can do likewise in countries in the EU. It's not quite as widespread, but it is something that is still available. You can even take your existing phone numbers in several countries and port them, take them from your current provider, move them to Microsoft, and then say, turn off that old Avaya solution. Enhanced 911 functionality is built into it, and you can call local and long distance. There's practically no limitation to what you can do. There are one other dot color you'll notice here where Microsoft has partnered. So instead of offering it to you first party, Microsoft has partnered with Telstra and SoftBank for Australia and Japan respectively to actually provide the calling plan services because Microsoft just couldn't get through the certification for those countries. So they partner with those providers in order to give you phone numbers on their behalf. So calling plans, super easy way, very quick way to get not meeting dial-in, but to get actual phone system functionality for a Teams user that is not using or didn't have any Skype for Business configuration tied to the user account. And then the more advanced one is the direct routing plan. So again, direct routing, it's built around this concept of you have what's known as a session border controller, which is a specialized voice component that sits either in your data center or perhaps it's hosted on your behalf. Maybe a carrier like CenturyLink or Verizon is going to host it for you, or you can even host it in the cloud on something like AWS or Azure. But then that solution gets configured and you can effectively tie it into your phone system providers. So your phone numbers simply come in through the voice trunk and then get sent out to your Teams users. And likewise, they can also integrate with any existing telephone systems that you may have. These session border controllers are very flexible. They can be IP only, or they can include some of the legacy telephony functionality that you may need to integrate with for things like analog lines or maybe T1s and E1s. That functionality is definitely still available in the direct routing model. But this gives you the opportunity to deploy voice to Teams users in locations where maybe calling plans doesn't make sense, or maybe it's simply just not available. So I wanted to give you that primer just on the features and functionalities, and now to the ICANN elements of Teams. There are the four major things that I personally think about and that I espouse to customers when it comes to deploying Teams for voice for the real-time media workloads. And again, it boils down to infrastructure for customers that have Skype for Business. How do you handle coexistence? And then the adoption plan. And then once all those are mapped out, the actual path you take and the navigation of getting from the start line to the finish line with the least amount of bumps and bruises and black eyes as possible. So first and foremost, I'll start out with the infrastructure since that is near and dear to my heart. Mark covered most of these already, and from Microsoft's perspective and their recommendations, and it's been this way for a number of years, is there are four major principles of network connectivity. Identify and differentiate Office 365 traffic, number one. Number two, egress Office 365 traffic locally. Number 3, avoid network hairpins. And number 4, bypass on-premises security. Now, I will admit, not all customers will agree or go through and do each of these. To each their own, each person's path and each customer's path is different. But in general, if you go down this path, you're better set up for success than you were if you didn't. And if you don't want to take my word from it, you can take Paul Colleen. He is a program manager specific to the Office 365 network group. He's got a great session from Ignite 2018 that goes into in-depth detail about this topic. Since he had 90 minutes, I don't have that long, but I've embedded it in there so you can watch it at your leisure. But I'm going to cover some of the high spots from his presentation. So one of the first things is, why do I need to identify and differentiate? And the major reason is because there are different types of traffic within the Office 365 service. Typically in the past, we've had the four-wall mentality where everything is in our four walls in the data center. You don't get in or out unless we tell you to do so. With the movement to SaaS, all of those flows have now gone outside of the firewall, outside of all the security infrastructure, out onto the internet and to a remote data center that you don't necessarily control. So one of the things that you have to do is really identify and differentiate that traffic and treat it the way that it should be. So the first level of traffic is considered optimized. It is the bulk of the traffic that you will see from an end user perspective that goes out to the Microsoft data centers. It includes things like SharePoint and OneDrive. It includes all of the connectivity between your Outlook client and Exchange Online. It also includes Teams. By far, it is the most latency and bandwidth sensitive because it's the most end user visible. So if latency gets really, really high, end users will start to notice it. Or if you don't have sufficient bandwidth, people will start to notice it. This is also the category where the Teams media traffic resides. There's no DNS names that are associated with that media traffic. It's IP address based only, but UDP is the preferred path for all of the Teams media traffic because it's quick, it's fire and forget, and it generally is the, even for on-premises systems, Cisco, Avaya, Nortel, whatever the case may be, they use UDP for media. Teams does the same. The optimized category, you also must do certain things around the security stack in order to allow the applications to work. Two of those is if you do any kind of SSL inspection, you have to turn it off. There are cases and scenarios where things like Outlook and Teams or SharePoint simply will not work if you're using something like a proxy server to crack and inspect the TLS traffic that's coming from your client endpoints. And same thing, any kind of network hairpins and deep packet inspection, if you're using firewalls like Checkpoint or FortiGate, some of those solutions can mess with that traffic and cause some problems. Then there's the allow category, which is really there to help bolster and help support the optimized category. In most cases, this traffic is web friendly, so TCP 80, TCP 443, mostly 443. You do still need to bypass SSL break and inspection, again, proxy and any kind of hairpins. But in most cases, the allow category is generally less sensitive to bandwidth issues or latency problems. And then last but not least, there's a default category, which is really, I'm paraphrasing Microsoft, they really don't care what you do. As long as the client can connect to it, it can go through a proxy, it can go through a firewall, whatever the case may be. So ideally, Microsoft would like the Office 365 admins and the network infrastructure team to identify this traffic and apply some configuration on the network equipment and the security infrastructure to adhere to these policies in order to make things work the way that they should. And to give you an example of some of the URLs that are associated with these different the different categories, You'll notice these top two are involved with the Outlook client, and then also with the Outlook mobile app. SharePoint, OneDrive for Business. You'll notice there is no URL in here for Teams. The Teams URL is actually listed down here. And again, that is because media does not flow by a DNS name. Media only flows directly by IP address. So you'll never see a DNS query for media in here. But just some samples in here to give you some perspective around some of the addresses that are out there. Microsoft documents these URLs. They are updated every single month. So if you ever have a question, it is published on the Microsoft Docs page. You can find it at any given time. There's even a REST web service that you can use to query and find that info. And the reason that I bring it up is because Microsoft themselves, you know, they've got 50 plus now data centers. We as end users don't actually connect directly to the data centers. What we connect to is what's known as a service front door, and it's this section right here in the middle. In order for us to get to that service front door, though, our traffic has to take a path, and it's analogous to, you know, pre-COVID, we all got in our cars and we drove to an office building, and that's how we did work. Those streets and highways are analogous to the various network locations that Microsoft, the Microsoft network actually peers with all of the various providers all across the globe. So for instance, if you would really like, the Microsoft Global Network, which is autonomous number 8075, is what your Teams traffic and SharePoint and OneDrive and Exchange Online and et cetera, it's the information superhighway in which that traffic gets to the data centers. And one of the reasons that Microsoft does this is because they try to place some intelligent business logic there to optimize the location of the end user's data. So for instance, if I am a user, I live in Nashville, Tennessee, so relatively south central, southeast, it would make most sense that most of my data would be stored somewhere on the East Coast or maybe in the data centers in Texas or Iowa. But if Microsoft sees all of my traffic coming from an IP address that is allocated to the West Coast, they may actually move my content to a data center in that location because they think it's actually closer to where I am. Likewise, the same logic could play out for someone who may have a tenant that exists in the UK. All your data is in the UK, but if you in the US are not connecting directly to the Microsoft network as close to where you physically are, you may be taking a longer journey than what is necessary to actually get to that data. This is just a map of the Microsoft Global Network. If there's any doubt in the scope and breadth and depth of what Microsoft has built with the Azure network and the Office 365 network over the past 4 to 5 years, they are in it to win it, and they're very serious about it. There's almost 135,000 miles of fiber optic cable. There's now 3,500 ISP peering partners. These dots that aren't completely filled in are Azure announced regions. So you'll begin to see like Mexico City, for example. In the future, there will be some enhancements where Microsoft allows Mexican native tenants to have data stored natively within Mexico. But the point of the picture is simply to say that they are everywhere. And if you let the traffic get onto the network as soon as possible, generally speaking, you're going to get there as quickest as you can. Now, an example of this, this particular website down at the bottom here, connectivity.office.com. If you're ever curious about where your traffic is going, you can go to that website. It will run a quick test, and it will actually show you on a map where you are located and where the nearest Office 365 front door is located. One interesting thing that I have seen over the past 3 weeks is that as the remote work from home has really taken hold, a lot of the network infrastructure operators like AT&T and Verizon, Microsoft, Level 3, Cogent, etc., there have been very fluid alterations of the way the traffic is flowing to get to and from the various locations. So this is where I am. I actually, as of Wednesday of last week, went to a Microsoft front door in Chicago. I didn't change anything, but my ISP peering with Microsoft simply routed it a different path, whereas typically I would go right smack dab down to Atlanta. This works regardless of where you are in the world. You can test it anywhere. So if you're in the UK, you can test it in the UK and it will show you a UK-based map. I just happen to do this for the US. But the reason it matters is because we always connect to those service front doors. So in general, we should always send those network requests to the service front door without any intermediation. The problem is, work from home, people have forgotten about VPN. VPN has been a huge stumbling block. Many of the Microsoft resources that I know, they have spent the past 3 weeks working with customers on trying to work around some of these VPN issues because nobody thought that it would have to be a 100% work from home scenario. So either the VPN concentrators are overloaded or more need to be set up, or split tunneling wasn't configured to just let the traffic go out to the internet and then you use the Office 365 security services as they're meant to. So this has been a big problem for many customers as of the past couple of weeks. And what I wanted to show you was to give some meat to that discussion and give you some actual data. So I've got a customer here to show an example of. It was an automotive manufacturer from the Northeast, and I'll go through some of the data. To give you a little bit of reference, Microsoft has some performance requirements that they want you as a customer to meet in order to successfully have a good experience with Teams and with Skype for Business Online as well in the legacy days. These are the metrics. Most of the time, we end users, we don't really get a say in this. The work from home mentality, though, has significantly changed the way these requirements are really impacted to the end user, because no longer are people connecting to very high performant and large bandwidth corporate office locations. You're connecting from DSL lines or cable lines, or maybe you're lucky enough to have fiber at home. So even so, most of these metrics can still be met. As a matter of fact, I am actually at the moment running the test on my PC. So this is the Skype for Business Network testing tool. So you can see what my metrics are here. I can get to Microsoft in about 25 milliseconds. But as long as you fall somewhere within this range, Microsoft says, yeah, your audio calls should be good, your video calls should be good, your screen share should be great as well. This particular customer, though, it was very problematic. So this particular customer was based in Upper New Jersey. The closest Microsoft network ingress point was New York City. Unfortunately, anybody who was on VPN, or even anybody who was on the corporate network, got backhauled. Their traffic got backhauled to a cloud-based proxy solution called Zscaler. I'm sure there are some customers on the call today that may have Zscaler. But that call went to Zscaler, which the node was based in Washington, D.C., and then it actually routed back to New York. So it added a significant amount of latency and packet loss on top of this particular configuration that impacted calls and meetings. Sometimes you would have, the dreaded delay where you would talk over one another because there was so much time for the media packets to travel, or the call would drop altogether or fail to connect altogether. And the pilot users were definitely not happy. And what I've actually got here is these are some of the results from the testing tool. So you can see there's 3 lines. The bottom line is the lowest, and then the middle is the average, and then the top is the peak. The maximum of all these reported values. And you'll notice the maximum reported values are pretty much during business hours. That they are definitely encroaching on that 100 milliseconds round trip time that Microsoft wants you to adhere to. Likewise for jitter, jitter is the delay between packet arrivals. So packet A, packet B, packet C, what is the amount of milliseconds between A and B, and then B and C, and then C and D, D and E, et cetera, et cetera. This is supposed to be no more than 30 milliseconds. And we have values at the end of the day that peak to almost 750. So calls were really, really bad. And this particular customer, they were not very happy. So what we ended up doing was we moved towards split tunnel, local egress. And as a result of that, the metrics took a nosedive and a nosedive in the right direction. So you'll see the peaks are now right at about 52 milliseconds round trip time, which is great. That is half of what it was before. Likewise, the jitter metrics never went beyond roughly 14 at its peak. Again, a significant reduction in performance, or in the latency, which ultimately makes the performance better. So this particular slide here is really just meant to show these particular graphs come from an analysis solution that Microsoft gives you as a part of the Teams suite. So IT admins and network architects can actually look at how things are performing on a site-by-site basis, and as the months and the weeks go on. And you'll notice that before we made those changes, we roughly had about 2,500 streams total, and the poor percentage of those streams was bad to a point, almost 4%, which is very, very high. We had a 7-time stream increase, and subsequently the amount of poor calls or failed call percentages plummeted to about 0.5%. That's a huge difference. If you do the math, that is a huge difference. So again, local egress, proxy bypass, VPN split tunnel, huge wins. You can't guarantee that things will be great, especially with kids being home, watching Netflix and those kind of things. But the codecs themselves should be able to adapt, and the additional bandwidth and connection points that Microsoft has should mitigate most of the problems. So proof that it does matter. The second piece, coexistence. So I break coexistence down into 3 major categories. The first is, especially for Skype for Business online voice customers or Skype for Business on premises voice customers, you've got differences in feature and capabilities between Skype for Business and Teams. And then there are some differences in how the devices work, either from a support standpoint or from a usability standpoint. And then you've got your end users. How do you support the end users, and what is the adoption plan for them? So I'll go through a couple of these and just point out some things. First and foremost is what is known as the coexistence mode or the upgrade mode. I know a lot of people on the call this morning mentioned that they were in islands mode by default. And islands mode is great if you need to kick the tires and if you really do need to use both solutions simultaneously. However, the implication of islands mode is that it actually has some ramifications for customers that are using USB devices or phones for the enterprise voice and meetings functionality. I'll cover some of that later. All of that to say is I'm not a huge fan of islands mode at the get out. There are some other coexistence modes that you can use to specifically control and tailor the functionality that the end user sees, and ultimately drive your coexistence path in a controlled manner, as opposed to islands mode, which is kind of wide open, so to speak. For customers that are using handsets today, maybe it's an AudioCodes handset or a Polycom handset. In the Skype for Business days, you had this thing called Better Together over Ethernet, which was you could control your desk phone via software on your PC. So you could mute it, transfer it, end the call. You can click the buttons on the PC and it would actually control the phone. That same functionality doesn't yet exist in Teams today. It's coming, but it's going to take a little bit different form, and it's going to be called Better Together over Bluetooth. So this introduces an interesting problem for customers that may be using VDI. So if you've got VDI endpoints, just something to think about where you may need to have Bluetooth turned on those VDI endpoints if you need someone in order to be able to use the Better Together over Ethernet functionality, or excuse me, Bluetooth functionality. Dial plan capabilities. So this is always one of those tough conversations. Many well-entrenched enterprise customers have very complex dial plans. Like if I'm in Atlanta and I want to be able to call someone in Tokyo, say I dial 7 and then a 3-digit number in the user's 4-digit extension. That kind of capability is still present in Teams, but there's some limits on it. You can have up to 50 of those rules in what's called a dial plane in the Teams world. The question that I would really pose to customers is, do you need it? We are, especially work from home, where most people aren't going to have IP phones. More people are comfortable with simply finding somebody in a chat window and starting an IM with them and then calling them immediately from there. You don't need the extension dial plans. Likewise, I don't know if anybody else on the call will agree with me, but cell phones, I pretty much live by my contact list and by my SMS thread list. I don't remember phone numbers with exception of mine and my father's. I actually don't even know my wife's phone number, to be honest. I'm ashamed to say it. But it's a change in theory and behavior that most people could definitely get over with some proper training and user adoption. But something to think about what you want to do with it going forward. E911 support is a big deal in the US, not so much for some of the countries outside of the United States, but there is new national E911 laws as of February 2020 of this year. It's called Kerry's Law and Raybaum's Law. Microsoft has support for static and dynamic E911. You must configure it. The way the law reads is that if you can dial a pizza place on a client, regardless of brand or functionality, they must also be able to dial 911. So it's definitely going to change the way that some companies do emergency and life safety plans. Something you'll need to think about because it may require some additional functionality and or backend infrastructure in order to make it happen, depending upon calling plans or direct routing. Some device support changes. So the coexistence mode, this is one that actually gets us in Perficient all the time, because we use Skype for Business on-premise for voice. We're using Teams for a lot of the meeting functionality. When you are in islands mode, or even if you're in Teams only mode, if you have a USB device plugged in, you will notice that depending upon the device manufacturer and the device model, you'll notice that sometimes you can't use the buttons on the headset in order to control the device. It is expected. It also happens when you have things like Zoom or WebEx or GoToMeeting or Amazon Connect. Like you have, especially with work from home, you have all these people using these different technologies. It's basically all of the apps are trying to compete with controlling the USB functionality, and that's Microsoft included. So in general, my guidance to a lot of people is get out of islands mode. Especially for me, I can't mute on my headset. It's really, really annoying, and it's a problem. But coexistence mode, when you're in islands mode, that is definitely something to think about. For customers that do have existing IP phones, those Skype for Business phones, you're going to have to replace them. They have a limited shelf life. They'll need to be supported prior to July of 2023, and they have limited feature support for some of the Teams functionality. So just something you'll have to be prepared for. Many of the vendors have buyback programs, or some of them even have leasing programs now. Or Especially with work from home, you simply begin to look more at a USB-based lifestyle. You don't need a desk phone. You have a headset, whether it's wired or wireless. Conference rooms, same kind of scenario with conference rooms. You'll likely require some capital expenditure in order to replace them. If you have third-party systems like Lifesize or Cisco, you'll probably need to purchase the cloud video interop service in order to make those devices work seamlessly with Teams. It will work. It's just something to make sure that you think of. It's an extra license that most people don't factor in. And likewise, with work from home, it certainly begs the question, is it better to plan on doing virtual conference rooms rather than physical conference rooms? Things like virtual whiteboards and cameras are significantly cheaper to purchase and just send to users to use at home, as opposed to having a very complex and potentially hard to use conference-based solution in a physical conference room. Teams has a virtual whiteboard, so are physical whiteboards really needed? Well, possibly not, but something definitely to think about given the work from home going forward. Adoption. This is a section that I know David talked about. I won't spend a whole lot of time on some of the pieces in here, but people, especially now, are significantly more mobile. We've got 4, maybe 5 generations of people in the workforce, in the amount of teams that people work in or with on a daily, weekly basis has skyrocketed in the past couple of years. The context switching problem, it's a real thing. I see it today, even with just email and Teams and Skype. You've got a very disjoined solution. So we really do, when we look at the technical teams working alongside the adoption teams, we try and keep these 4 principles in mind. First, end user focus, keep the employee experience at the forefront. Tool consolidation, there's no reason to have 5 different video conferencing or web conferencing solutions. More is not always better. Simplicity almost always wins and improves the end user experience. Make sure you do your planning. So things like network planning and governance planning, security planning, having all of those pieces done at the front of the deployment as opposed to doing it midstream or at the end makes everything easier to plan, and it makes the adoption framework significantly easier to lay out to end users because you have the full picture for the long term. And once you've got those first 3, it's really just a matter of you begin the turnkey process. And not every execution is without road bumps or some potholes. That process is iterative. So as you come across things that may need to be factored in and re-alter your adoption, by all means do so. Don't just forge ahead with blinders. Be sure to take feedback and impacts of your decisions and feed them back into the cycle. So a couple things to think about with end user supportability. Again, coexistence mode is a big one. One of the first ones that people will start to see is when you're in islands mode. Now you have 2 meeting buttons on the Outlook ribbon. You have a Skype for Business meeting button and now a Teams meeting button. Which one do I use and why? Well, I'm not getting audio conferencing, a dial-in info with the Teams meeting, so I guess that means I can't do that, and I have to use Skype for Business. Things to think about because it ultimately impacts the user experience. Another big problem with coexistence mode, especially in islands mode, is instant messaging and presence. When you are in islands mode, the term islands is accurate. They are 2 completely disjoined and separated systems, meaning I can't send something from Teams to a user in Skype for Business in islands mode. There are other modes that you can. And likewise, my presence state is not synchronized. I could be in Do Not Disturb in Teams, but still be green in Skype for Business. This is as designed in islands mode. It's one of the reasons why I try to tell people not to do islands mode. But It's generally not a problem, but it's going to result in end user confusion on the why. Why can't I do this? And it's one of the reasons why there are other coexistence modes that I would highly suggest you use in order to control that process. Device support. So things to think about with devices, conference room devices and or things like attendant consoles. So say you've got a receptionist that does a lot of phone calls on a daily basis. How are you going to support those users when some of the features and things that they used to do on the IP phones may not be available moving forward in the Teams world as of yet? Likewise, what types of USB devices would you potentially need to purchase in order to fully support work from home? Jabra, Plantronics, Sennheiser, there's all supported devices out there, but the key is to provide users a certified option instead of allowing the wild, wild west, because certification of those devices is paramount in order to actually provide a good end user experience. It was that way with Skype for Business. It is still that way with Teams today. And then lastly, you've got what I would coin the adoption versus optimization quandary, which is, training users how to use something is really not particularly anything. It's really just usability training. Adoption and optimization is, how does this tool make my life as an end user better or make me more efficient? Most people focus on the former, really just the usability aspects. How do I make a call? How do I transfer a call? How do I do a meeting? The pieces on top of that is taking Teams as the platform and still having the usability aspects, but building on top of that to make me as a IT professional or a business user more productive. Lastly, and certainly not least, is really the navigation of it all. For anybody that's seen a Microsoft presentation in the past 18 months, you've probably seen this particular slide. And it's really just a graphical representation to show that your journey, it is a journey to Teams. There is no ifs, ands, or buts about it, that they are two very different products. They do a lot of the same things, but in slightly different ways. And there's not necessarily a requirement to rip off the Band-Aid and go from one to the other. You can take a staged approach if you so choose, if your requirements dictate that. The key thing to think about is if you've done proper planning as a part of the 4 steps of execution, you'll know how many potential stops and coexistence modes will be required in the midst of your journey. So for instance, Joel showed this diagram earlier. There's a couple other coexistence modes that you can see in here. One of the final mode is Teams only. It's where you use Teams for everything. And then in Islands mode, you've got people doing things on both hand sides. There is actually 2 other modes where you can configure Teams to just use collaboration. Everything else stays in Skype for Business. And then there's another mode where you can use chat and calling in Skype for Business and meetings and collaboration in Teams. So ultimately what you are able to do is take these migration approaches and do baby steps. And say you start out with collaboration first, and then maybe you move into meetings second, and then you go into full voice third. The point simply being, don't think you have to bite off the entire apple. You can take small slivers and make adjustments as you go on. A couple roadmap determinators that I'll just kind of throw out here. Mark kind of covered some of these, some of the prerequisite plannings. What type of security and governance solutions need to be in place? Do you need things like data loss protection and Intune and cloud app security and Defender and Azure threat protection? Are there features there that you're going to need in order to support Teams as a solution, or perhaps work from home scenarios given COVID? Those will obviously feed in. Network topology and telephony topology. What is the strategic desire for the company? Is it to keep phone numbers on-prem or to move it to the cloud? And if it's the latter, then begin looking at that solution and that roadmap to drive your overall planning strategy of getting those numbers to the cloud. Devices and operational support. So devices, what types of devices are needed? What types of user personas? User personas could be things like road warrior versus information worker, or road warrior versus executive. Each profile will have certain usability features that they're looking for, and they'll have certain device needs as a result. Operational support is a big thing. I come from internal IT. How are you going to support this stuff long term? What happens when something breaks and you got to try and figure out why the call was bad or what happened? Having some of the operational support built in ahead of time makes it less of a fire drill. Adoption and change management. Do not skip this part. I cannot overstress that by any means. But again, define your goals. Are you just training users on the tool, or are you wanting to maximize their productivity through the usage of the tool? And then migration planning. So thinking about work from home, how are you going to support end users as best as possible from an IT perspective when you really can't be there to help guide them and touch them? This was a quote that actually was really from the Skype for Business days, but in the end of the day, work is something you do, not necessarily a place you go. So it's to all our benefits to best support something regardless of whether a user is, rather than putting on blinders and saying we only need to support them when they're in the four walls of the building. So just a few key suggestions. Do not look at Teams as a one-to-one replacement for Skype for Business. A lot of people look at it as such. Does it replace the bulk of the features? Yes, it absolutely does. But it really is a re-envisioning of the tool that was Skype, that introduces not just a technical change, but a way to alter core business functions along with the people that are associated with those functions. Teams is not just collaboration or meetings or calling. It is a product that is a sum of its parts, and it changes on a monthly basis. If you feel overwhelmed by the amount of stuff that's out there, you are in good company, so do not feel ashamed to reach out to Microsoft partners or some of the Teams user groups in the community for information and frameworks around, how do I make sense of the madness that is the solution that seems to be Microsoft Teams. User adoption, again, it is critical, absolutely critical. Planning should always lead, and the framework is always iterative. No framework is viable without change and adaptation along the way. And then lastly, on the technical side, follow the Office 365 connectivity principles as best as possible. It doesn't guarantee everything is going to be great, but Teams will benefit heavily as a result, as will the other workloads that are in the stack, and your end users will ultimately thank you for it. So with that being said, I am almost at the top of the hour. Any questions, comments, concerns, things people are seeing, especially work from home, or just networking questions in general?
For the various coexistence modes, is it more just a matter of company culture and preference, or is there sort of pros and cons to the various different coexistence modes?
It's a bit of both. So culture could definitely be a reason to force you into one coexistence mode or the other. More often than not, I would say the coexistence mode configuration ends up being a desire to try and control the change management process in a phased approach, rather than a one weekend cut over, rip off the Band-Aid kind of thing. That's been my experience anyway, but usually it's a combination of culture and either a business need to control the process, or maybe there is a technical gap that there may not be a solution for quite yet.